Performing a literature review is an important first step when trying to understand what is known about a phenomenon of interest and what is still not yet known about a phenomenon of interest. So in this lecture, I'll provide an overview about what a literature review is, and then I'll get into some of the specific steps involved in a literature review. So let's start with the overview. So a literature review refers to an examination and synthesis of the research on a particular phenomenon of interest, where a phenomenon of interest could be anything that you're interested in that you think has been evaluated in some way, shape, or form in the scientific literature. So for example, if you're interested in the effect of potentially happiness at work on performance, or in other words, the potential association between level of happiness of employees and their level of job performance, then that would be a phenomenon of interest that you could potentially explore using a literature review. Now you'll note here in the definition that I put systematic in parentheses here. And this is to note that a literature review does not need to be systematic. However, for the sake of this lecture, I'm going to be referring mostly to systematic literature reviews, which means that you're really combing through the literature with a fine-tooth comb, and you're thinking very critically whether or not you have saturated or reached a point of saturation in which you found all possible, or at least most of the possible published research, studies, reviews, and so forth on the topic that's related to your phenomenon of interest. Now, a non-systematic literature review would be if you do a really quick kind of investigation or review of the literature to see what's there, but you haven't really looked to identify what is not yet known, or at least you won't be able to be as confident when it comes to what is known and what is not yet known with respect to the phenomenon of interest. So again, if we're thinking about a literature review as a systematic examination and synthesis of the research on a phenomenon of interest, then we're also thinking about how we can use it to evaluate a body of literature with the goal of identifying what is known and what is still unknown regarding that particular phenomenon or topic that we're interested in. Now, literature reviews can be used for different purposes. And so, for example, they can be used to understand what is already known about your phenomenon of interest or your topic. And this can be an important first step because it helps you prevent reinventing the wheel. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that we want to avoid doing and replicating research that's maybe already been replicated a number of times, and there might already be systematic reviews such as meta-analyses, quantitative syntheses, as well as systematic qualitative reviews of the literature already. And if that's the case, then maybe we don't need to do a localized study or an investigation within our own organization, because perhaps we already know what the state of the particular phenomenon of interest is with respect to the literature. Now, another reason that we might use a literature review or conduct a literature review is to inform evidence-based organizational interventions. So going back to that example of our phenomenon of interest perhaps being the relationship or association between happiness at work and the relationship with job performance, well, in that case, if we comb through the literature and do a systematic literature review, we might identify that there's a number of different drivers of happiness in the workplace. So if we want to improve happiness to then improve the association with, in order to make people more likely to have high job performance in the workplace, in that case, we might identify what those drivers are and design interventions around those, because those would be evidence-based interventions to some extent. Now, additionally, you might actually find research studies that have systematically reviewed or tested whether or not certain types of existing interventions can improve, say, the relationship between happiness and job performance, or specifically improve happiness, for example, so that then the effect of happiness on job performance, assuming that there is a positive association there, might lead to higher job performance. Now, third and finally, literature review can also be used to inform and inspire homemade organizational research that investigates an unknown or that explores a phenomenon in a specific context. And so what do I mean by that? By that, I mean that sometimes we might find in the literature review that we still don't know something really important about our phenomenon of interest. For example, we might know that in general, happiness, let's say, is found to be associated with job performance in the workplace. However, we might not know under which conditions that relationship or association is stronger or weaker. And so for that reason, we might explore locally within our organization and see, well, what's the case in our organization? And are there any moderators or boundary conditions that can help us understand that association between happiness and job performance? So now let's talk about the specific steps involved in the typical literature review. So generally, I like to think that there's 4 different steps. The first step is actually conducting a literature search. Second step is evaluating the literature that you found through the process of conducting that literature search. The third step is assembling and synthesizing the findings from your literature search. And then finally, the fourth step is to communicate and deploy those findings. So let's start with conducting the literature search. And I'll cover this very briefly. So a literature search is essentially just the process of finding sources such as articles, book chapters, and so forth that are related to a phenomenon of interest or your topic of interest. And here I've also put systematic in parentheses here because it doesn't necessarily need to be a systematic literature search or a lit search for short, but it can be. And so I'll refer to more of a systematic lit search process here, but an unsystematic one would be simply you just go to some type of search engine or database, Google Scholar, for example, and you just try to find, okay, what are the top hits that I'm getting here? Let me get a lay of the land here on my phenomenon of interest by just collecting those top hits and just quickly reviewing them. So that's kind of a quick and dirty literature search, but I'll be focusing on a more systematic one where we really comb through that literature and try to reach what we call a point of saturation, where we're just not finding new studies or sources that we haven't already found that are related to our phenomenon of interest. So a literature search, I like to think of it consisting of 7 different steps. First, you have to identify that phenomenon of interest. Sometimes we like to frame this in terms of a question that we formulated or a hypothesis that we have, but it doesn't need to be in that format necessarily and doesn't need to have that framing. The second step is to determine the search terms that you're going to use. Now, this is more applicable if you're doing an electronic search. If you're doing an old-fashioned manual search, you'd actually go through maybe journals and so forth, past issues, the physical copies of them, and look through the table of contents. And then if you see a title that looks relevant, then you jump to the abstract, see if that's relevant. A little bit different type of search there. Today, it's amazing how many articles have actually been transferred to a digital format, even those that were published decades ago. And so for that reason, I'll talk mainly about the situation in which we'll be doing an electronic search. And so there it's useful to think about what are the search terms we're going to use. So for our phenomenon of interest is again that example of happiness and job performance. Well, in that case, we might look at the search terms being, well, happiness, job performance, maybe just performance, maybe work performance too. Happiness is generally part of positive affect, and so we might also search for positive affect as well as related discrete emotions like joy, for example, enthusiasm, and so forth. And we might start playing around with different combinations of these search terms and using Boolean logic in order to search using the logical OR operator, for example. Okay, the third step in a literature search is to create exclusion criteria, or conversely, you can think of inclusion criteria. So this is essentially the list of things that what are you going to set as kind of standards or criteria for determining what sources you're going to include or retain and which ones are you going to reject. The fourth step is to select different search tools that you might use. Now, I mentioned earlier the idea of using a search engine such as Google Scholar. This is fairly common now. You can also use other types of databases that are available through many libraries such as PsycInfo, EBSCO, and things like that. And just deciding what tool you're going to use is a great place to start there. You don't need to use a lot of tools. Google Scholar is fairly expansive today, and so a lot of people kind of use that as the primary search tool, but you might also take some time to do manual searches too, where you comb through research that you're interested in, and those pieces of research or sources that you found that seem to be citing a lot of important studies, well, you might actually look through their citations and references and then manually try to find each one of those as well. The fifth step is to actually conduct the search. The sixth step is to track the literature that you found. There's different ways you can do this. You can use citation managers, sometimes have features that allow you to track things fairly easily. And then also sometimes you can use an Excel spreadsheet to track in different aspects or create different criteria in which you can evaluate the different sources that you're found and capture key pieces of information. And that really gets to the seventh step as well, which is organizing that literature as well. And by that, I mean also not only organizing it within a spreadsheet, for example, but also thinking about how you're going to sort or store the PDFs, if that's the type of file that you've used to capture your sources. How are you going to store those? Are you going to use a hierarchical filing system and so forth so you can find those readily? Okay, so as I mentioned a little bit earlier on too, when it comes to identifying that phenomenon of interest, I just want to reiterate that formulating a question about the phenomenon of interest or the topic can help keep the literature search and review focused and efficient. So that's important. And I literally mean that sometimes you can post your question above your monitor, if that's how you're doing your electronic search, is using your computer, and actually just keep on looking up at your question of interest. Is happiness associated with job performance, for example? And just make sure that everything you're searching for, you don't go too far down different tangents and you stay really focused on what the core of your phenomenon of interest is. Okay, so what is the second step in performing the literature review itself? Well, that is to evaluate the literature. And so when you have reached a point of saturation that I've been mentioning, and this is a point of saturation in your search, which means that you're not finding new relevant hits. So you're not finding any new sources that seem to be relevant for your phenomenon of interest. And therefore, everything you're finding, you've either already found before or it's not you've deemed it irrelevant before. So once you've reached this point of saturation, it's time to evaluate your found literature. And so there's different quality indicators that we can consider. And so I'll review 5 different quality indicators when it comes to evaluating our literature. The first is source type. Then there's peer-reviewed content type. There's journal impact factor, source cited by count, author cited by count. So those are the 5 different indicators that we'll focus on in a little bit more detail now. So let's talk about, in terms of source quality, let's talk about source type. So what do I mean by this? Well, I'll generally categorize source type as a refereed or peer-reviewed source versus a non-refereed or not peer-reviewed source. So when we're talking about a refereed or peer-reviewed source, this is typically where you're going to see your scholarly or research journal articles published are going to be in refereed or peer-reviewed journals. But that doesn't, just because something is researched doesn't necessarily mean that it was peer-reviewed or refereed. Also, there's some practitioner journals too that are more application focused and practice focused, and those can also be refereed or peer-reviewed as well. And those are good ones to look to, especially if you're looking for evidence-based practices related to your phenomenon of interest. Now, with non-refereed or not peer-reviewed sources, these include things, typically book chapters are not refereed, at least not in the classic sense. Neither are textbooks, although they might have some friendly reviews. It's a different process. White papers are typically not refereed as well, and research blogs are almost never going to be refereed or peer-reviewed in any way. So when we're assessing quality of the source type, we're going to find the findings that come from refereed and peer-reviewed journals are typically going to be considered more trustworthy. And just intuitively, they're more trustworthy because they've already been through some layers of review by typically reviewers who are blind to who the actual authors are of the original research or the review or whatever type of article that they're submitting to their journal, for example, as well as those authors being blind to who the reviewers are. Okay, and so this is often an iterative process where you go through 1, 2, maybe even 3 rounds of review at a given journal. And so because it's gone through those rounds of revisions and suggestions and commenting and so forth, typically you're going to have more rigorous research that's actually published in such journals that are refereed or peer-reviewed. And that tends to make the findings in those studies more trustworthy. So let's now talk about a different quality indicator, which is the peer-reviewed content type. So this is diving within that category of peer-reviewed content and sources. And so this would be, again, talking about scholarly or research journals and the articles that they publish, as well as refereed practitioner journals as well. Okay, so what I'm about to show you is really an adaptation of various tier systems that I've seen, one by scienceforwork.com, another one by Deerholt and colleagues from 2018. And what I'm doing here is just organizing the different types of research papers or articles that you might come across in a peer-reviewed journal in terms of their level of not necessarily just rigor, but also the confidence that you can have in their findings, the trustworthiness of their findings, and so forth. So let's start with Tier 1. What's a Tier 1 peer-reviewed content type? Well, this is going to be any type of systematic qualitative review or meta-analysis of randomized controlled studies. So randomized controlled studies are really the gold standard. You've probably heard about these before. Sometimes they're referred to as RCTs, randomized controlled trials, especially if they're in the pharmaceutical or medical setting. But this is really our gold standard here. If we can get a systematic review of some kind, whether it's qualitative or quantitative in nature of randomized controlled studies, we are exceptionally happy, because if our phenomenon of interest has had a systematic qualitative review and of randomized controlled studies on that phenomenon of interest, that means that we know a lot about it and we can be very confident in what we know and what we don't know about that phenomenon of interest. Now, Tier 2 is going to be any randomized original controlled study. So any original randomized controlled study where you have a control group, that is going to fall into Tier 2. Okay, so Tier 1 is when we have a lot of those that we've now been able to review. In Tier 2, the other type of peer-reviewed content that's going to be relevant here is systematic qualitative reviews or meta-analyses of a combination of randomized controlled studies and non-randomized controlled or uncontrolled pre-test, post-test studies. Tier 3 is going to be the next step down, and this is going to include systematic qualitative reviews or meta-analyses of non-randomized controlled studies and/or uncontrolled pre-test, post-test studies. It also includes non-randomized controlled pre-test, post-test studies themselves. Now, Tier 4, this includes peer-reviewed content such as non-randomized controlled post-test only studies, uncontrolled pre-test, post-test studies, uncontrolled interrupted time series studies, and systematic qualitative reviews or meta-analyses of longitudinal cohort or panel studies. So this means that we've looked at our phenomenon of interest with regard to that last one over time, and we have enough studies on that phenomenon of interest that we can have a systematic qualitative review or meta-analysis to understand the existing research on that topic. So Tier 5 is going to include systematic qualitative reviews or meta-analyses of cross-sectional studies, where a cross-sectional study refers to a study that's been done at a single point in time. Okay, so there's nothing longitudinal about it. All the data were collected at a single time. Now, Tier 5 also includes longitudinal cohort and panel studies, so original studies that are conducted over time, where perhaps the different variables were, if you're looking at happiness and job performance, for example, happiness was collected at time 1, a time interval passes, and then at time 2, job performance is collected. Tier 6 would be an original cross-sectional study. And finally, at the bottom, we have Tier 7. And this includes case studies, case reports, theory papers, and non-systematic reviews. So the reason I have organized peer-reviewed content type along these 7 tiers, and the reason I was inspired to do this by other people that have come before me, is because this is a great way of deciding how trustworthy a particular source you found is with respect to the information and findings that it's presenting to you. Tier 1 is going to be more trustworthy. Tier 7 is going to be the least trustworthy. Now, when we're thinking about the organizational science literatures specifically, it's going the peer-reviewed content types that I've highlighted, or rather that I've changed the font to purple here. These are going to be the ones that are relatively common design and types of content that we're going to find in the organizational in sciences. So that includes, sometimes we do find randomized controlled studies in the organizational science today. There's been more of an emphasis on doing such studies. It's going to be, however, really rare in my experience to find in the organizational sciences any systematic qualitative review or meta-analysis of randomized controlled studies. We just don't typically have enough of these randomized controlled studies. And that's a lot has to do with the type of applied research that we do in organizational sciences with real companies. It's hard to do true randomization in a true experimental way. But other examples of types of designs that you do see in the organizational sciences include non-randomized controlled pre-test, post-test studies, cross-sectional studies. There's a lot of those. We do see a lot of case studies, theory papers, and so forth. And we also are starting to see more and more longitudinal cohort and panel study designs as well. So now let's talk about another quality indicator when it comes to evaluating our literature that we've found, and that is the journal impact factor. So an impact factor is an indicator of how widely read and cited the articles that are published in a particular journal are. And so the higher the impact factor, the more impactful that particular journal is with respect to citations and so forth. Now, one of the highest impact factors that I'm aware of is generally that of Science magazine. If you get published in Science, you're going to have often a lot of visibility, and not just within your particular discipline of interest. This is a general science magazine or journal in general, and so you'll get more exposure. And so that's one of the explanations for why you have a higher impact factor there. But when we think within the organizational sciences and management, specifically human resource management, the Academy of Management Journal has a fairly high impact factor, where if we see something around 6, 7, we're starting to talk, this is a high impact factor here. Similarly, the impact factor for the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology is also quite high as well. And that one's been growing recently as well, but that's a more narrow niche discipline than the Academy of Management Journal. And what I mean by that is that the Academy of Management Journal could publish studies that would appear in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology, but not all studies that are published in the Academy of Management Journal would fit into the purview of the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology. Now, in addition to journal impact factor, there are some lists of top journals. And so one that I'm aware of is the Financial Times list of 50 journals currently that are used in their research rank. And so sometimes this is simply called the FT50 list. And it does list journals like Academy of Management Journal as well as others like Journal of Management and so forth. And this tends to have more of a European focus to it. But because the Financial Times, I believe, is a United Kingdom-based news source. But with that said, this is also something that you can use to kind of vet the quality. If a journal appears on that list of 50 journals, it's very management-focused or business-focused in general, then you can feel relatively confident that what's being published there is going to be of reasonably high quality, if not very high quality. Now let's move on to another quality indicator, which is the source cited by count. And so what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you're interested in, and you find a particular source. You find, let's say, a journal article. Let's say you find specifically this journal article, which is by Anderson and Gerbing, and this is published in Psychological Bulletin in 1988. And this is a very influential structural equation modeling application paper here. And you'll see down here that there is a cited by count if you use Google Scholar, and some other search engines and databases also have a similar feature. And so what this shows you is how many published or also unpublished too. This can also include dissertations and theses and so forth that are not published. But how many times has this been cited since it was published? Well, this was published in 1988, and this has been cited, this particular study, or this particular paper, 39,486 times. That's quite high, at least in the context of psychology, management, and so forth. We can also think about another related quality indicator, which is the author cited by count. And this is where we look at a given author, such as Baron Erdogan here at Portland State University, and we see how many citations have they had across all of their known publications. And this is something that's captured by Google Scholar. And so you'll see here that we have the citations. Current at this point in time, when I pulled this information, Baron had 11,049 total citations. And then you can also see here, this is a screenshot. Her top paper had, at that point in time, 1,439 citations. And you can also see over time too how their citation count has grown or stayed stable or whatever the case might be. We also have some other indices here. We have the H index and the I-10 index, these are also indicators of the author's productivity. So the I-10 index, for example, is how many articles have they published that have at least 10 citations, or at least 10 other sources have cited them. In this case, Baron has 56. The H index is how many, let's see if I get this right, how many publications does that person have that have received H citations. So essentially, let's say someone has, in this case, Barron has 41, an H index of 41. This means that she has 41 publications, at least that Google Scholar is aware of. At least she has 41 publications with at least 41 citations. Okay? And then you also have more recent indices. Well, how many since 2015 and so forth and so on. Okay, so authors cited by count can also be a useful way for identifying researchers who are producing generally high quality or highly impactful research. Okay, so let's talk about the third step in performing a literature review now, and that is to assemble and synthesize the findings. So the process of assembling and synthesizing your findings will help you draw conclusions about what is known and what is not yet known about your phenomenon of interest and the question you have formulated, if you did formulate a question about your phenomenon of interest or topic. So some things to consider are as follows. First, you want to ask, well, how well were you able to answer the question you formulated about your phenomenon of interest, if you did formulate a question? Or if you didn't formulate a question, how well were you able to really feel like you reached a point of saturation in terms of your phenomenon of interest or topic? The next question is, based on the literature, what is known about your phenomenon of interest? So what seems to be a consistent finding within the literature? What are consistent moderators or boundary conditions you've come across? Anything that you found that you feel very confident about that we can say, we know this about this phenomenon of interest. And then also relatedly, what are the key findings? If you had to distill it down into a list of, I don't know, say 3 to 10 key findings, depending on how large the literature was that you reviewed, what are those? Also, are the findings consistent across studies or sources? If not, are there reasons why findings differ across studies? And so this gets into that idea of moderators or boundary conditions. What are those it depends conditions? Well, the association, for example, between happiness and job performance is stronger in this context or under these conditions. Those are important things to identify as well when you're assembling and synthesizing your findings. We also want to consider what is still unknown or not yet known about the phenomenon of interest that you're investigating. And this is an important thing to identify. And this is sometimes where we call this gaps in the literature, things that we have not yet found. And so this can be really important too, because these are essentially our blind spots, so to speak, where we don't yet know, no one's formally investigated that aspect. And so we might find that, yes, happiness and job performance, let's say hypothetically, is more strongly related in type of organization X. But what we might not yet know is maybe no one has looked at, well, what about age? So does the age of the individual who's experiencing the happiness and performing the work that would, in order to be, that would be evaluated as job performance ultimately, how does age affect that association potentially between happiness and job performance? Okay. Now, finally, what are the implications for practice and an organization? So what have you found after synthesizing and assembling the findings? What would you actually recommend to your own organization or to any organization about in terms of what is known about this phenomenon of interest and how you can turn what we know about this into something that can be practiced by the organization, something that can be applied. So the fourth step in performing a literature review is to communicate and deploy the findings in some way, shape, or form. So this is really the final step typically of the literature review. And this is really where, as I mentioned, you're going to communicate and deploy your findings, but also come to conclusions and communicate those conclusions and communicate the recommendations you have as well. Now, communication recommendations include identifying a suitable communication method, such as a report or presentation. Also, using effective storytelling practices is going to be helpful as well. In terms of deployment recommendations, I recommend piloting any interventions to establish proof of concept. So if you look across your literature and you find that, wow, that looks like there have been some systematic reviews or on a particular type of intervention in an organizational settings, related to your phenomenon of interest, that's great. But maybe before you invest heavily in that, pilot it within your organization. It's especially important to do this if you didn't identify any proper intervention studies, but instead think you found different levers or things that you could influence with known methods within your own organization. If that's the case, you want to make sure that you pilot those things in a small, more refined or confined way in order to establish that proof of concept before you roll it out more broadly. Another thing you want to consider when it comes to deployment is to identify use cases that can help illustrate specific applications of whatever it is that you're recommending and trying to deploy. And then finally, try to apply effective change management methodologies. Anticipate that people are going to be resistant to change, or at least some people will, when it comes to whatever you're trying to deploy. And so for that reason, make sure you take steps to guide people through this change process in a careful way and a thoughtful way. Change can be scary for people. It disrupts people's habits. It makes them sometimes question whether they have security in the organization in terms of their job or employment. And so we want to be very sensitive to these things when we're trying to roll out or deploy anything that we've found based on our literature review. Okay, so this wraps up this lecture on how to actually perform a literature review. We started with an overview of what a literature review actually is. And while this focused mostly on systematic literature reviews we might conduct, you can do unsystematic ones as well if you just want to kind of get a quick lay of the land in terms of your phenomenon of interest. Now, after that, we went on to talk about what are the specific steps in performing a literature review. This wraps up the lecture on performing a literature review.